So it's really important that I hear from you, that I address the questions that you have. I really want you guys to give me feedback. And if you don't understand something, I can stop and we can talk about it, because I assumed, great, Kim, thank you very much. So I assumed a certain level of knowledge because you're medical students, and perhaps I'm wrong or so. So I have one fundamental question. So there are a couple of things I would like to do. And the first thing I want to do is take you away, you're out of your comfort zone from medical school. So everything that you learn from neuroscience, I would like to step away from that and take you into sort of an approach that I use in my own research, which is more of a broad overview into how nervous systems and circuits are put together and how different circuits can create the same behavior or very similar behavior. So I want to start doing that by asking a fundamental question, which as a doctor, which you are or you will be soon, I think it's really important for you to answer. And what I want to know as a fundamental question to this, in terms of neuroscience, if you think about the brain, and if you think about brain specialization in humans, what do you think is the one thing that makes us, that has been incredibly important in the evolution of human beings and what we have accomplished in the evolution of Homo sapiens? So that's my first slide. So it's a very important fundamental question. And I would like for you guys to, tell me your thoughts. What do you think? So type it on the chat and tell me what is really important in terms of biology. So we're not talking about art or literature or any of these things, but in terms of biology, what do you think has been one of the most important things that makes us what we are today? So take a second and think about that. What do you think, Hakim? Because I have my guess, so I will tell you what I think. Well, I would like to know what you think. What is, like, biologically one of the things that makes us very different than other animals? So what is special about our brains? So what do you think? Right? I mean, horses have brains, sheep have brains, my dog has a brain, right? But we're pretty cool. We're pretty, okay, I'll give you a few more seconds to think about this, and I'll tell you what I think. Sure, okay, Sarah says nervous cells. Okay. All right, so let me tell you what I think. Oh, humans can think. Okay, that's very good. That's really, so that goes into the lines of what I'm thinking. So one of the most fundamental things about making knowing, knowledge, exactly. And well, how is knowledge transferred? So that's, I think we go fundamental to that question. So I'll give you my punchline. It's really nervous out, so everybody had a good answer, because the question is, I think, fundamental to be a human is language, right? If you think about this, our brains and our evolution and why we became so successful in this world of ours is because we have language. Sure, we have different languages. We all, you guys speak Arabic, I speak Portuguese and English, and I have friends who speak Farsi, all these things. But the fact that we as a species have language has allowed us to have a history, have allowed us to have knowledge and transfer knowledge. So I think humans are really all about language. So saying that, what I would like to do is to talk a little bit about language acquisition and how parts of the brain are involved in language. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how other animals have something similar than language. So language is very special in that it has syntax, it has a very strict structure, but other animals have something similar. Okay, so, humans, let's see, where's the button? Here we go. So humans have this innate ability to imitate sound and actually learn language. The fact that language is learned is incredibly important. So there's no innate language. We actually have to go through a developmental process in which we have to acquire. But we do have circuits that are set in place in our brains that are that we have a predisposition to language itself. So this is my cute little baby, chewing on his finger, and what this little baby does is he imitates his parents. So this idea of imitation is very important, and imitation in language is very important. Now, there are parts of the brain that are involved in language, and I sure hope some of this looks familiar. Does it look familiar? Have you talked about Broca's area, for example? And let's change color here. Wernicke's area. Have you guys talked about this before? Somebody do in the chat. Hakeem, Rudy, Amani, somebody. Have you talked about this before? These parts of the brain? Sarah, you haven't said anything. Ah, terrific, Sarah. Thank you very much. This is great, because that's what I wanted to hear. So there are, these areas that are really specialized for language. And it turns out that I'm going to show you today that there are parts of other animal brains that are associated and they're specialized for something called vocal learning. So if you look at language, very specialized, very different because of syntax and grammar. But there are different types of vocal learning, which vocal learning is the basis of language. So it's a step below that. And vocal learning is extremely rare in nature. So if you look at animals in nature, they have vocal learning. It's the ability to acquire sounds from parents or tutors or others. And there are very few species. So there are a couple of species here. Of course, we have humans. We learn from our surroundings. Bats learn to do their clicking and their communication sounds from their parents. And same is true with cetaceans and whales and dolphins. They're very, very diverse, and they're open learners, which means that they keep learning from others. And what I think is pretty amazing are hummingbirds. Hummingbirds learn their vocalization. So it's not an innate ability. It actually has to be acquired. Of course, this is not surprising that parrots do this. You know, you can talk about a parrot, you know, repeating what you're saying, so they will learn the vocalization. The one animal that I want to bring into attention is this little guy here. So this is a zebra finch. And I don't know if you guys heard of a zebra finch before, but zebra finches are wonderful animal models because they're songbirds. And songbirds have specialized areas of the brain, which we will see throughout the talk today. But I want to take a step back because whenever I talk about this, I have people saying, well, you know, my dog understands what I'm saying. You know, if I tell my dog to sit, it's understanding. Is this language? And it's not. So what we call this type of learning, we call this auditory learning. This is basically making an association with a behavior. So this is an auditory learning. And this is very different than vocal learning, which are these animals are doing, which is actually the ability to imitate the sounds that you hear. So it's very different than that. And it's also very interesting because all vocal learners, so all these animals that I talked to you before, they have been found to have parts of their brains, forebrain specific, regions that are associated with this behavior. Not just the learning part, but also the vocalization part. So if we look at brains, for example, of different birds, they are associated, you know, they're homologous areas in all the birds and in humans. And I will show you the similar pictures throughout the talk today, which I'm hoping I will convince you that there's some similarity in how human brains have basically solved this problem during evolution, and how independently birds have solved this problem of creating vocal learning throughout evolution. And it's beautiful because these two solutions are very similar to each other. So in this graph here, I'm showing you brains of birds and a human brain. And you can see that there's certain similarities. For example, the frontal region of the forebrain, there are specifically 3 neural nuclei. They're associated with production of the song. Songbirds, and we will see this a lot throughout the talk, have this area particularly associated with the basal ganglia, which creates a loop, which is the learning and vocal and motor output of language. And the same thing you can see in parrots. So these animals and humans, obviously, they have come up with the solution independently. And what we have here, you know, for example, is Broca's area and associated areas in the brain from the forebrain all the way down to the, you know, cerebellum and brainstem. And that's the same thing here. This is the vocal output. So these are So are there any questions of this file as this file uploads and we see what happens? Are there any questions so far? I mean, I don't know. Are you convinced that there's something worthy of study in this case? Here we go. It's uploading. Hold on. So you know what? I'll just keep talking. We'll move on. So the idea for humans is, you know, when did, oh, here we go. Something moved. When did language begin, basically? So we think that language, the ability to do vocal learning and create language has happened with the genus Homo, which is about 5 million years ago or so. And but that's not for sure. Some people argue that is much later than that, about 120,000 years ago. And there are even questions that we will address actually at the last part of the talk, that perhaps even Neanderthals could have some kind of vocal learning or language, because they did have the apparatus in their morphology. The bottom line really is that we really don't know. We're actually not sure how this works. Okay, so here's this uploaded again. So let's see if we can make this get through. So we did talk about this. So we don't know, right? So, it went really fast. But we do know that the development of language, any of the evolutionary hypothesis of how language evolved really has to do with learning from our parents. And this is a very interesting question. And let's just take a quick look on how this happened. Regardless of whatever theory, a lot of people spend a long time on this and a long time thinking how we learn to speak and how we gain language. There are lots of theories out there if you want to take a look. But basically, there's a certain pattern. So there's a pattern of babbling or learning to speak. So newborns, for example, they make little sounds, and we know that. And about 3 months or so, they can start making the vocalizations more sophisticated, and you get little coos and goos, and they actually have different types of vocalizations for different situations. As the baby gets older, they start creating more sophisticated sound. They start using their lips more correctly. About a year old, they start using their first words. They say mama or papa or whatever culturally significant words, abba, ima, or whatever it's relevant to their particular language. And about 2 years or so, the baby starts asking very simple questions. So they start creating a language, a grammar. So they start understanding how to put these elements together. So this is can be expressed in terms of perception and production. This is a summary that we have here, and we have basically your timeline for about a year. And you can see that language creation can be divided into the production, where infants start babbling. They don't have a real speech. They don't have words. And they start acquiring specific phonemes. They are specifically sounds from the particular culture where they're from. Then they start comparing one versus the other, and they start creating the output that is correct for their family. One important part here is babbling. This is called canonical babbling. It's when babies start, blah, 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 blah. They talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. It may make no sense whatsoever, but it's a very important thing for the brain and the nervous system. This babbling is actually incredibly important for the creation of neuronal connections, and we'll see that, and for the strengthening of synapses that are in the brain, and they're associated with the production of language. Well, this is very exciting, though, because if you do comparative studies and you look at birds, for example, birds that learn to vocalize, they have the same structure. So they have a perception, and they have a production. So they create something called a subsong, and they have a particular period in their brains and their perception where they can actually learn the song. And this may seem very familiar to you because for us, for humans, when you learn to speak, you know, if you learn before you're adolescent, you end up having basically no accent. But your brain, after the neurons go through the shock of adolescence, through the experience of having this hormonal change, and you can learn languages, but you're always going to have an accent or you're always going to have some kind of difficulty. So it's very similar. Now, the other thing that the birds do is they have sort of a babbling phase. So birds also babble. So humans babble and birds babble. And I'll talk to more about this in a second. So let's look at their brains in a comparative way. So let's look at this a little bit more carefully. So we have here some vocal learners. We have a songbird, a parrot, and a hummingbird. And these are the 4 brain areas that are specialized in these birds. So if you look at something like a chicken, for example, or if you look at a macaque that does not have these comparative sensory structural areas specialized for vocalizations, then you will see that there are similar areas in a songbird and a parrot that have emerged through evolution. And it's really, really true. And this is really significant and interesting because they're actually specialized nuclei in these animals that are not present in animals that do not create vocalization. So let's look at this brain here. Let's look at a songbird. And the songbird that I want you to meet is an animal model called a zebra finch. This is what they look like. They have horrible vocalization. They have something called a song, but it's really a screechy noise. It's just terrible. And what they do is when they hatch, only the males vocalize, which is interesting. And what they do is they learn their song from a tutor. So they learn their song from a male, either a father or an uncle, or whoever's in the community that's a male. And this is what the song looks like. So what I'm showing you is a spectrogram where we have time in the x-axis, we have frequency in the y-axis, and the color basically means intensity. So this is the vocalization, and everybody's vocalization is the same. We can plot human speech, we can plot whale vocalizations the same way. But the idea here is that these animals have something we call syllables. So you can see patterns here, so something here, that can become repeatable parts of the vocalization sound. So what I'm showing you here is just different syllables of this song, and you can see that G here is repeated of here. And you can, if I could play a vocalization for you, actually maybe I can. Hold on a second. I'm going to play this vocalization. Hopefully you can hear it. Let's see if this works. Okay, wait a minute. Let's try it again. All right, so that horrible noise you heard, actually a vocalization, and you can see that they're repeating patterns. Now, we know that these patterns are very important, and the baby bird learns from the adult bird. But we don't know exactly how where in the brain and how the connections in the synapses are organized so that this tutor song is actually stored and how is involved into creating the bird's own song. So it turns out, so let me show you some data let me show you the real data. It turns out that this is similar to humans. Let me show you some real data. These are particular neurons in the brain of these animals. They're part of the circuit that creates these vocalizations. And it turns out that they're very, very responsive to the bird's own song. So the idea then is that the brain itself, the circuitry itself, will have a template in which the bird will compare its vocalization during the babbling phase to this template in the brain. So this is what I'm showing you here. This is an electrophysiological recording where we have time versus number of spikes or number of action potentials. I hope this looks familiar. If not, this is pretty simple to understand. It turns out that when you play the song, so this is part of the audiogram, this is the song that's played, this is the stimulus. When you play the song of the it responds incredibly well. So if you this is the BOS, bird own song. If you play the tutor, the father or the uncle, the neurons will also respond well. Now, as a control, you can play the bird's old song backwards, and you can see that there's actually not much activity, or any other adult, there's not much activity. So it turns out then that during these sensitive periods where the brain is forming and comparing the babbling with this internal template, what the vocalization would be, there's a lot of activity in specific neurons in the forebrain for the bird's own song. So this is a really interesting developmental aspect. All right, let's just skip ahead. I want to talk about, we want to talk a little bit about sensitive periods, because this happens in humans and this happens in birds. And I mentioned this already. And this is because there's evidence from both deaf people and from deaf birds that the song or the vocalization of people decays. So the circuitry itself, when you think of forebrain circuitry, is not able to maintain the level of motor output precision if it doesn't have sensory feedback. So this is an example of a bird. We could have used the human example too. So this is the syllables. This is the same frequency over time, and you can see lots of syllables here. This is pre-deafen, and if you have a baby bird and you deafen the bird, you can see that there's a decay, that every syllable starts to fall apart. So here we can't even tell what syllable this is. And if this happens, so the baby bird was deafened during that period of babbling, this critical period, then the vocalizations really completely decay. This is consistent with what we see in humans too. So they both have a model where vocalization has required a sensory feedback. So the idea then is that you have an auditory feedback that tells you what you're saying. You have direct input from regions of the brain that get this auditory feedback. They go into motor nuclei, so this is sensory going to motor, that creates the song, creates this auditory feedback. So there is here areas of the brain, of the forebrain, that do this comparison between an internal template with the auditory feedback. We'll make adjustments to the sensory motor nuclei to create a motor output. Right? So it's really a similar system to what we see in humans. Humans do the same thing, even though they have different brains, and we'll see that in a second. It's interesting because I told you the zebra finches are the animal models. We do have other animals that have interesting forebrain organizations that have that the sensory motor critical periods are opened every season. So it's under hormonal control. So that's the, one evidence that we have from animals, that during spring, the canaries, for example, will learn their song again and again and again. Now, how do they do this? Because we have very different brains. So birds don't have cortices. So a cortex is really a mammalian invention, right? We have forebrains and midbrains and brain stems. But if you look at a human brain, it's vastly different than a songbird. You know, there are no sulfate, there's no nothing like this. But we do, if we look a little bit deeper, we do have shared mechanisms and shared organization, particularly talking in terms of the basal ganglia, which we have here in both of them, and it's a shared connectivity. In birds, however, so I'm showing you here 4 images. So these two here learn their vocalization, right? This is a songbird and a human, and these two do not. This is a chicken, and this is a monkey. So monkeys vocalize, but they won't not learn a language. They will not learn their vocalization. So there is very strong conserve mechanism between these two animals. And it has been a shared mechanism, which is really interesting. So if you look at humans and songbirds and you do a little bit of a comparison between them, it looks like Wernicke's areas and Broca's areas, for example, and in various other parts of this brain area are similar to something we call HVC. So this is really in the forebrain. There are contributions, of course, of the cerebellum with the precision of the motor output. So this is fine-tuning of song creation and language creation. But you have the sensory motor integration really being similar in both analogous areas of the brain. This is associated, of course, with the basal ganglia that leads direct input into the motor output. So it's the same similar system, and we have analogous regions for both of these animals. Now, one very exciting thing that we can do in birds, but you can't do in humans, is that you can look at neurons, very precise neurons. They're doing the same thing. So this is a beautiful study done in birds. This is done in the zebrafinch, where the neurons have been individually labeled and they have been imaged in vivo. So these experiments were done with a live behaving animal. And it turns out that there is, in the sensitive period, there's an increased capacity for learning, which is associated with the sensory motor practice. And it's really associated with the creation of spines. So neurons that have the capability of learning, they create new spines that get more stabilized. So you can see here these neurons are in green. This is a close-up. This is a close-up of this particular area here. And I hope you can see the idea is as the animal is learning, they're using the same cellular mechanism as we think the humans are. So they're creating more spines and they're becoming more stabilized. So this is a consistent hypothesis, a consistent hypothesis of learning is really the creation. And you can see the spine, one spine coming up right here in this highly branched and highly convoluted neuron. I think there are a couple more that you can see in here. So this is a very dynamic process. And you can actually see this happening. If you can image these neurons and you can see them over time, and you can see that there are always little spines coming in and coming out. And when they go through experience and the song crystallizes, the song gets learned, these spines stop going in and out, and they actually are stable. So they're part of the circuit. So we see converging mechanisms in bird songs and human speech. There's certainly different pathways, but they are very, very similar to each other. So they both have an early development when you have an auditory learning process, when you do your babbling and part of your sensitive period. We know that young humans and juvenile birds of many species have an initial listening phase, as we saw in the diagram, that then leads to a motor phase where they start creating sounds, and that both humans and songbirds actually use this vocal learning from a tutor. So they use the environment, and usually it's a social environment. So they actually have connections with somebody, either a parent or somebody in their family, to create this vocalization. They need a tutor. They need a teacher. So let's, I want to briefly, I know we've been talking for about 40 minutes or so. I want to just briefly look at, you know what, let me talk about something else. I'm going to skip a few things because I was just going to tell you about the anatomy. And I think because we've been so long, I actually want to tell you about some really interesting things that are towards the end of this talk. So give me a second here. Let me find this slide. And we're just basically talking about anatomy, and we're talking about humans and similarities, how these two pathways converge. And I can certainly give you the PDF of this. This is nothing earth-shattering. But I wanted to pick out and tell you two things. One of them is that there's evidence for the role of sleeping in learning. And this has been done in birds, and we know that there's a lot of evidence in humans that sleeping is really important for motor learning. So if you learn a task, if you learn to play a game, if you learn to even learn a new song or learn some new letters, and if you take a nap, you will actually remember this better. So there's this is a whole nother lecture, and it's really interesting. And sleep is, you know, a very interesting question in neuroscience. And we know, however, from electrophysiological recordings of the forebrain in birds, that when the juvenile bird learns the tutor song in the sensory phase and then sleeps, it needs to create, you know, of course it needs to create its own song, and it has to compare what it's singing to the template that it had from the tutor in this loop. And how it does this is very interesting, because if you do electrophysiological recordings from this area called RA, don't worry about it, this is just the forebrain area. And RA is actually fairly silent during the day when the bird is actually interacting and creating vocalizations. But during the sensory period, the sensory motor period, when the bird sleeps, it actually is very active. And it's very active in very specific ways. So what these neurons are doing is they're replaying what they heard during the day. So you can imagine them as dreaming the sound of their tutor. So during sleep, the birds, basically the brains are singing to themselves during sleep, which is fascinating because it appears that, zebrafinch, they sort of store the neuronal pattern, firing pattern for song production during the day, and they actually practice or read it out at night. So during this period where they're practicing in their sleep, where their brains are actively creating these outputs, is where birds will create their own interpretation. So you can actually see that one bird has a little bit different syllable than another bird, and we think that this is when it's happening. This has been shown, similar studies have been shown, have been done in humans, and it turns out that if you learn, so in this experiment, you learned a set of words, and you had to recall them. So you can do this. This is basically a control that you just recall them without practicing, and this is your recall after practice. And if you do it early in the morning, there's, you know, the main thing we're looking at here is the difference between this and this. And if you do this study here, and if you have 12 hours between learning and actually testing, if you remember them, you're actually better because it took a while to integrate this information. But if you took a nap, you're much better. So this difference here is actually better. So this points towards the evidence that the information is getting, the sleep is really important for information to get crystallized, not just in bird brains, but in human brains. So it's similar mechanisms. Now, in the last few minutes, what I want to do is I want to show you some really, really interesting novel research on this particular gene. So the crux of the question then, is there a genetic makeup, or is there a genetic network that is shared? Because so far I've just told you a lot about evidence of behavior, and I showed you evidence of anatomy. And now, is there any evidence from the genetics, or any shared genetic pathways or networks in human speech and bird song? And people didn't have this evidence. But in the past few years, we actually came up with, we as in the scientific community, have made discoveries where there's this particular gene that is associated with vocalization behaviors. And this gene is called FOXP2. FOXP2 was found in England, and it was found from a family that has a mutation on the gene, and they have deficiencies in creating vocalizations. It's almost like they are Broca patients, and they have something called a developmental verbal dyspraxia, and they have difficulty creating and the motor aspect, the putting it together in the motor aspect of the output. So if you look at the genetics of these people, and this is the KE family in England that's associated with it, you can see the unaffected family in light color and the affected family. And basically, it's not gender specific. So you can see that males and females have this type of aphasia. This is particularly associated, this is one of the family members, and this has been associated with Broca's aphasia. So it's very interesting because of the phenotype of the output of dyspraxia. So they basically have an inability to create the output. So if you look at the brains of these patients, there are particular areas in the brains of humans that are associated with dyspraxia. And some of them, this is an unaffected group, and you can see during speech, you can see Broca's area being particularly active. And when you have dyspraxia, a FOXP2 mutant human, you can see that language is really distributed throughout the rest of the brain. Now the question is, in the last few moments, what happens with other animals? Is there a shared shared genetic mechanism in birds and mammals and humans that have the same FOXP2 basis? And it turns out that there is. So I'll split some slides here. I'm going to talk about Neanderthals, but it turns out that you can do experiments where you inject a knockdown gene of FOXP2 on the forebrain of zebra finches, and if you inject them right before the sensory motor or the sensory part of their learning, you're affecting the forebrain, and they are unable to learn the song as well and produce the song. So the question, the crux of the question is the motor outputs. So if you look at it, this is a sham control. This is an injection or just with the vehicle. This is an injection with a protein marker. And this is an injection of the blocker of the gene. This is a FOXP2 injector. And this is similarity score between the song of the baby bird and the song of the tutor. You know, of course, the controls are very similar to about 100%, but FOXP2, it goes down a lot. It goes down almost to 50%. And you can take it apart and you can see that the, you know, variations are in the duration, the pitch, and the frequency modulation, and the overall organization of the song. So it really has an effect on how these animals are have a shared genetic network. This is very exciting result. It's fairly new and people are really pursuing this. So just to close up then, so obviously language is very complex, right? And we have syntax and we have grammar. But I hope you're convinced that animals such as songbird are good models for learning about language and how language is structured and how language is created. It turns out that there are genetic clues about the evolution and the emergence of language, and that's associated with vocalization. And that these comparative studies between humans and birds is a worthwhile endeavor to do. So if you look at the common things between human speech and bird song, there are all these little things that we talked about, you know, that their innate predisposition. It turns out that babies really get excited. They get a fast heartbeat when they actually hear somebody talking. And the same thing happens to baby birds. You know, they have a physiological response to a vocalization. They both have this early phase of learning vocalization, which is initially just hearing, and it becomes later vocal production, babbling. Both animals will babble, which is really interesting. And we have this critical period. You know, we can learn a language really well when we're very young, but we have problems after adolescence. So in both groups, you see a capacity for vocal learning, but it's not as good as the learning itself because of hormones and puberty. So we believe, so far, people who are studying these things believe that there are similar neuromechanisms and similar genetic mechanisms involved in learning of vocalization in birds and learning language in humans. So I have my last cute picture here to finish up. We have, you know, a cute little monkey hugging a pigeon. And you know, we have 5 minutes for questions if you want. So I'm here to answer any question that you would like. I'll put the chat up here so I can see what you're typing. But are there any questions? So the idea was to really take you out of your comfort zone of just talking about humans and medicine and really talk about, you know, other animals that really can come into play and do comparative studies with, you know, with these other creatures and talk about how evolution has created, converged in these two sets of circuits in the brain. Okay. Oh, this is very nice, Sarah. I appreciate it. It's totally my pleasure. It's no problem. I'm very happy to talk to you, and I hope as you know it was worthwhile for to talk about these interesting items, what I think at least are interesting issues in comparative biology. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, I'm going to put down my email here. So, so if you have any questions or just want to talk about neuroscience or, you know, science in general, I'm going to put my email here. Please send me a note, right? Because I can help you. So, you know, my research is much broader than this, but this is one of the things I really like. So, you know, email me if you have any questions, or email me if I can do anything to help. Okay, sounds good. So I'm gonna, oh, there you go. I hope you liked it. Thank you very much. Okay, this is great. Well, I hope to hear from you guys soon. And I'm gonna sign off and put my kid to bed because it's late here, so he needs to go to sleep. So I have to go. So I'll talk to you later, and do send me an email if you want. Okay. Okay. Cheers. Bye-bye. Talk to you later.